Welcome back to the long exposure. Today we're going to be talking about exposure. Now, exposure is one of the most important things you guys need to understand because you can have great compositions. You can have amazing foreground and amazing backgrounds. You can have you can be in front of the Taj Mahal, or you could be in Machu Picchu or somewhere else and have the best photo you've ever taken right in front of you. But if you don't know how to use your exposure, you're not going to get a very good photograph, okay? Now, one thing about exposure, okay, you've learned the exposure triangle. We'll just review it one more time really quick, okay? You have ISO, okay, which in digital terms is, film as well, it's a little bit different, but in digital terms, since most people use digital nowadays, it's the sensitivity of your sensor from the light that's coming to expose it, okay? So, for example, a 100 ISO is a lot less sensitive than a 640 or a, or even a 200 ISO, okay? So meaning less light has to hit it to expose at higher ISOs, more light has to hit that sensor to expose the correct exposure at lower ISOs, okay? Then you have shutter speeds and you have aperture, okay? Shutter speed, of course, is how long the shutter is open, okay? So if it's open for 1 second, that's a 1 second shutter speed. If it's open for 1/8 of a second, that's an eighth, okay? Now you have apertures, okay? The larger the number, the smaller the aperture, okay? So the aperture, as you get a larger number, the aperture is gonna, the smaller the number, it's gonna become larger. As you knock down those apertures down to smaller letters, larger letters, it's gonna become smaller aperture, okay? So remember, large aperture, small number. Small aperture, large number, okay? Now we're going to go into more details about all those things, about how you can use them for specific effects and specific shots that you want to get. But right now we're just going to cover exposure, okay? Now, you've all seen the exposure meter. If you look in your viewfinder or even on the screen and you focus or hold the button down halfway on most cameras, you're going to see that meter. It goes from -2 to +2 in most cases. Maybe one stop more or one stop less, okay? And in the middle is 0, okay? Now this is the mistake that a lot of photographers, especially starting out, make. They assume that the meter being in the middle on the 0 means it's the correct exposure, okay? And some people say that's correct. And, in a lot of cases it can be correct. You can go out in the field, meter the scene, and get a correct exposure, okay? That is correct. But you're just going to get a bland photograph a lot of the times, okay? A good example of this is sunset photography, okay? If you go out here to a sunset and you get a correct meter, you're not going to get a very, very, very interesting shot, okay? So it's really, really important that you understand the meter, that, if it's -2, it might be underexposed. If it's +2, it might be overexposed. But as you can see, especially in, in this situation, the foreground is darker than the background. Okay, so if I wanted to get those mountains a little bit more correctly metered, I would actually have to knock it down a couple steps, but this dirt behind me would become underexposed. Okay, vice versa, if I myself, wearing darker stuff, it's pretty loud, the light shining right on me. So the point is, use your exposure for what you want to photograph, not what your camera's telling you to do, okay? This is why it's very important to always shoot in manual, okay? For example, one trick that I've always used is in snow. You want to knock that exposure down 2 stops. Okay, so whether you use the aperture or whether you use the shutter speed to knock that down 2 stops, you're going to get a better exposure because snow often blows out the highlights and you can get a better exposure by knocking down 2 exposures, okay? Now on to actual exposure, okay? That triangle works together, okay? You're going to have ISO, shutter speed, aperture, okay? If you open up that aperture, guess what happens? More light comes in and hits the sensor, okay? So if you open it up, you're going to get more exposure, okay? So if your photo is too dark, you can open up the aperture a little bit wider. It's going to let more light in, and you're going to get brighter exposure, okay? One thing you have to watch out for that is if you have a small aperture, you're going to have a lot of focus, okay? Everything in your scene is going to be mostly in focus. If you open that aperture too wide, so if you're around like anywhere between like 7 and 11 or higher aperture, you're gonna have pretty much everything in sharp focus. Okay, if you open that much wider, get down to the 3 to 1.8 apertures, you're gonna start getting what's called depth of field, okay? So for example, if I'm using a really large aperture right here, you're gonna get me, but everything in the background is gonna be in focus. I mean, it's gonna be blurry, okay? Or if you focus on the background, that's gonna be in focus, and I'm gonna be super blurry. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're using aperture to change your exposures, okay? Shutter speed is one of the most ideal things to use with exposures because you're going to be getting a lot better. You're not gonna. You can use those effects. You can use a large exposure, a large aperture, and use a shorter shutter speed to get an effect, or you can use a very small aperture and a longer shutter speed to get that effect and still keep that effect intact, okay? Now, one thing you want to be concerned about with shutter speed is lighting, okay? If you have not very much lighting and it's in the evening or you're inside or something like that, you might not be able to get that shutter speed down enough to stop camera movement and having blur in your photographs, okay? So you want to use a tripod. If you use a tripod and your subjects are not moving, you should be okay to use whatever shutter speed you want as long as you have a decent tripod that is going to keep your camera from shaking around and moving too much, okay? Shutter speed can be used for a lot of cool things. Like if you use a longer shutter speed, you're going to catch movement and motion blur. Or if you are doing like, sports or photographing cars or something like that, if you use a very fast shutter speed, you can freeze that motion right there very crisply in that photograph, okay? The other thing you can manipulate is ISO, which I don't like to do very much. Now, the rule for ISO is you want to shoot at the lowest ISO possible that you possibly can, okay, for that lighting. Okay, so the higher the ISO that you use, the more grainy the photo is going to be, the less quality the photograph is going to be, okay? So right now I'm using 100 ISO, for example. This footage is crisp, it's sharp. I'm not sure how good I did on the focus. I don't have anyone here focusing on me right today. I kind of had to reach in there and kind of focus. I normally would bring like a post or something where I'm going to stand and focus on that to get the correct focus. But as you can see, everything is good. There's not a bunch of graininess in the background. The photo, the quality is good. If you use too high of an ISO, you start to get lots of grain. Okay, this is especially true when it comes to low light photography or even videography. Okay, if you're using a high ISO, you're going to start getting grain in your pictures. You're going to start getting not pixelation, but it's not going to be very good quality, okay? Now, you can use this to your advantage in some cases if you want to have that kind of grainy effect. Say black and white, you're trying to get like a 1920s, 1930s vintage type of a photograph or something like that. You could probably use that, but in my case, that wouldn't be the majority of the time. So what you want to do is get out in the field, go experiment, go take pictures, remember the triangle. If you bump that ISO to 200, all these other things are going to be affected by that. Okay, now your sensor's getting more light. Now you need to mess with either the aperture or the shutter speed in order to balance that out or get the effect that you want. But remember, like we said in the beginning, and this is why I covered it in the beginning of the video, above all else, make sure that you are taking the exposure that you want, not the exposure the camera's telling you to. Okay, so remember, stay in manual. Don't get off manual. Stay there. And a lot of cameras have like a live view function where you can actually click the screen and mess with your functions and see what the photo is going to be is estimated to look like once you take the picture. Mess with that, and you'll see. A good experiment is like I said, sunsets. Go out to a good scene with a great sunset. Mess with that, and don't take pictures with an automatic function, or with the bar right in the middle, and then mess with the exposure a little bit. And look at the screen to tell you what's a good photograph. And once you get a good idea of what your exposures are giving you and everything like that, your brain will start getting in tune with what actually looks good, and you won't even have to use that live view function as much as just being able to sight it out and know what exposures are going to work good for which situation. And guys, until next time, don't forget to subscribe. Look at my Amazon store in the description. I've written several books on photography, and it might help you out quite a bit. So talk to you guys later. Subscribe.